have everyone here with us today. I hope you're all doing well. It has been a while since I met all of you in person. And the reason I'm saying I hope everyone is here because this is one of the most amazing session and most enjoyable session you will have. And actually,
Buckle up, everyone.
yeah, I'm building a high expectation on you, Tarek.
Very, very high.
So we have been working with Tarek for 4 years now. We, mashallah, every single year, like it just we need to work with him again and again and again, and for more things. And mashallah, we know more information about him every time. He will talk about growth, marketing, foundation, and acquisition, and he's a great expert in growth and also in digital marketing. So yeah, I will leave it for Tarek to give you a brief about himself and also to start this session. Tarek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ralph. Awesome. I want to record this and I'll listen to it every morning. Just or if I'm feeling down, or
Record it. Don't forget.
I'll just play it back. All right, let me. Cool. Very excited, guys, to be with you today. So we have two sessions, right? So we're looking at growth marketing foundations and acquisition today, and after tomorrow, we're going to be looking at two other topics equally important. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Tarek. I've been working in this space, digital and growth, for over 14 years. I've worked with companies of different sizes in US, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Australia. Small companies with monthly marketing budgets ranging from $500 all the way to $500,000 budgets. My expertise has been in growth strategy, user acquisition. I've done CRO work. I've done work in user retention and marketing automation. And right now, I'm the founder of Blue Pencil, which is a growth agency. We work with B2B tech companies in the Middle East. We help them grow their sales pipeline and basically solve their growth challenges, growth issues. I also do fractional roles, so kind of like part-time head of growth or head of marketing roles. Actually, one of the companies that I'm doing this fractional role with is Adam.ai, and they are one of the startups, I think it was 4 years ago, 3 years ago at Taqadam, and they're doing great things now. All right, that's what I do during the day or in the afternoon. In the evening, though, I put on my mask and I pull out my guitar and I and I rock out. So I've been the guitarist of this band for the past maybe 10 years, I think, called Carl and the Rhythm Mafia. We played massive concerts. We opened for Bon Jovi. Any fans of Bon Jovi? 80s rock. Yes, big hair and leather pants. So they played. We opened for them. This was in front of 25,000 people in Abu Dhabi. By far one of the most thrilling nights of my life. So this is me right here with a beanie. And I had this look on my face, I think, for a whole week after the show. This is this is how thrilling the experience was. All right, cool. So, like I said, we have 2 days. Today, we're going to look at foundations, things that are really important for us to understand, because a lot of the things that we're going to be looking at, whether it's acquisition or retention, are built on these foundations. And then we're going to look at acquisitions, what goes into that. After tomorrow, we're looking at retention and product-led growth. And of course, besides the workshops, we have you guys have one-to-one mentoring sessions with myself. All right, you guys ready? Let's do this. Okay, first off, I'd like you guys to head over to slido.com. You can do that on your phone. Probably easiest if you do that on your phone. Use this code and make sure to enter your startup's name. So we're going to be using Slido for a bunch of exercises today as well as after tomorrow. So I want to make sure that everyone is on Slido, and and we're going to be using that for extra. Let's take a couple of minutes, and we can do that here with a QR code if it's easier. So you can just scan this QR code or go to slido.com and enter the PIN with your startup's name. And let's start with the first question. So this is kind of like a lobby question. And don't worry, the rest of the exercises are not talking about your preferences in life, but but it's all related to growth. Um, so let's just make sure everyone is using the tool. If you could get a superpower, which one would you choose? Would you rather fly, read minds, or be invisible? All right, we have a tie between flying and reading minds. I would never fly. I have a serious issue with heights.
Is it eligible to buy votes, by the way, or not?
No, sorry.
Is it eligible to buy some votes?
You can do whatever you want. If you can read minds, you can do whatever you want. Or if you can be invisible, you can also go and snatch whatever you want. All right. So how many we got here? I think we're 23. Great. Thanks, guys. This is great participation. Almost everyone joined. All right, let me just go over here. Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. All right, so what we're covering today, we're gonna look at, so the first half of the session is the foundations. So the foundations would cover the idea of use case maps, something that was developed by Brian Belfour. We're going to look at growth model components. So what goes into a growth model? We're going to look at defining your North Star metric, and we're going to touch on the idea of growth loops. Okay. All right. So if we want to do this in just in plain English, if you want to articulate exactly what growth is trying to do, um, your job really is just to find the right audience and maximize value for them. Okay. Now, notice one thing here is the focus of the value is on the value that the user experiences as opposed to the company or you. So, for example, revenue is not necessarily an indication of value delivered to the user as much as it is value to you as a company, right? So, and you'll see this is a theme that we're going to be that we're going to keep in mind as we're discussing the different topics like acquisition and retention. But really, that's what you're trying to do: find the right audience, maximize value for them. So one of the things that can kind of help you set you up for that is the idea of a use case map. So think of the use case map as literally just the base or the foundation. And a lot of the things that you're going to be doing in acquisition or retention or even monetization later on, they all stem from the use case map, or at least the use case map plays a crucial role in guiding those activities. Okay. Now the use case map is something. It's a map of 5 variables. And you want to do these 5 variables for the different use cases that your product tackles, right? So if your product only has one use case, that's fine. But if you have 2 or 3 use cases, you want to have these maps laid out for per use case. Okay. All right. So what do we got here? We got the problem, alternatives, the why, the ideal user profile, the ICP, and the frequency. Okay. So what is the problem? Simply, obviously, the problem that your product solves, and this is something that comes natural to any founder, obviously, is what is the problem that you're solving. The one thing, though, that I wanted to highlight here is that you want to, as much as possible, try and articulate the problem in the words of the user or the customer, right? A lot of the times, you as a founder, you might have one perspective on the problem that you're solving, but when you speak to a lot of customers, you realize that the problem kind of has slightly different perspective. So ideally, when you're articulating this in the context of a use case map, think of defining it exactly how your customers or how your users would phrase it. Okay. All right. So that's the first point, your problem. Second thing is alternatives, right? So here we're looking at the universe of alternatives to solving that problem, right? So we're not looking only at competitors, but we're looking at literally all the alternatives to that problem, solve that problem. So for example, let me give you an example. Let's say if you're a cinema, right? So let's say you're a cinema. You would think your competitors would be things like Netflix, uh, TV shows, right? So these are, you might call them direct competitors, but you also have an universal alternatives because when someone goes to the cinema, this is them basically spending their time or filling up their free time. So whatever activities that go into filling up someone's one's free time, these are all considered alternatives to going to the cinema, right? So just keep that in mind when you're defining the alternatives, not only competitors, but it's also all the different ways that someone can solve that problem. All right. The third point is the why. So the why really is the value proposition, pretty much is why your product over any of these alternatives. Why should someone pick your product as opposed to anything else? ICP, of course, very straightforward. Who exactly is facing the problem? And you can go as in depth as you can here. understanding exactly the persona, the motivations, the drivers, yada, 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 all that, to really have a very good idea on who exactly you want to target. And then finally, the last variable is the frequency, right? So how frequently do these users experience the problem? Okay, so the problem that you've articulated up here, how frequently is that a daily problem? Is it a weekly problem? Is it a monthly problem? Is it a quarterly problem? Is it a yearly problem? Now, the frequency is very important because what you're trying to do is you want to figure out the natural frequency of that problem occurring. And a lot of the retention activities, a lot of anything that goes into retention is going to be based around that frequency to a lot of to a lot of extent, right? So let's say if the natural frequency of someone experiencing that problem is a monthly frequency, you want to understand that it's a monthly frequency, so then you can build your retention around that, right? So then you know that you cannot expect this problem to be a daily problem or a weekly problem, right? But also you wouldn't want it to be a yearly problem or a quarterly, because this means that there's lower levels of engagement with your product. So the frequency is an important piece. And one thing I wanted to point out when it comes to frequency is that when you're starting out, you're going to put an assumption of what that frequency may be, right? And you might even speak to customers and have some qualitative input on what is the natural frequency of of the problem that your product solves. But as you start building a user base and as people start using your product, you want to then validate that qualitative assumption or hypothesis with quantitative data. So you want to look at your actual user data and doing some regression analysis and understand what is the natural frequency. So looking at the vast majority of users, for example, use your product on a whatever frequency, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and then you validate the initial hypothesis, right? Okay, so now we've gone through all the variables by use case up. Now, the reason why this is important is because, like I said, a lot of the things are going to stem from that use case map. So you can think of the use case map as a description of the natural behavior of users, right? And what you're trying to do with your marketing and growth efforts is to nurture that behavior, right? So you're nurturing it through, the different things like channel selection, messaging, your targeting, the metrics, all of these things would be stemming from the use case map, right? So if you have the use case map sorted out properly, this is going to help you a lot with all these other activities here. The other thing where you see value in the use case map is the idea that it connects your marketing and your product. So here, actually, we can replace this with marketing because it's really, we're specifically talking about marketing here, because growth typically can cover both marketing and product into one. But what you want to do is you want your marketing team and your product team to have some common ground. And a lot of the cases, a lot of companies, what they do is you have those two teams working in silos to some extent. You have your product team working in one silo, they have their product roadmap, and then you have your marketing team out there, running campaigns. But you really want to have these two units or functions in sync. And one of the things that can help that is having a use case map that is aligned between both. So basically, marketing and product both would have the same understanding of what the problem is, what are the alternatives out there, who fits the problem, frequency, all that stuff, right? All right, so let's look at an example here. Let's take SurveyMonkey, sorry, and see how SurveyMonkey, how we would apply that for a company like SurveyMonkey, right? So SurveyMonkey, for example, have two use cases. They have a free personal use case. So that's, for example, myself, I want to, I don't know, arrange a wedding or a party, and I send out a survey to my friends and family. Or it's a business data collection use case. All right, so let's look at each one of these variables and see how it's different. So in the case of a problem, the problem in use case one is that I need to get input on a personal project. While in the case of use case two, I need to collect data for a work project. Very, very different problems that we're solving. Alternatives also will be different. You'll see that in use case one, I might be looking at Google Forms, maybe send questions listed in an email, maybe send on WhatsApp, create a WhatsApp group, maybe create a Facebook group. While in the case of number two here, the alternatives could include things like customer user research, maybe going to a research agency, right? So again, very different alternatives or different ways of solving the problem. The why would also be different. So in use case one, SurveyMonkey would say that they are easy to use, offers templates, best practices for structured questions, building a survey. While in the case of a business, you can see, for example, that security is an important component. So security might not be very important for personal use case, but it is important uh, for a business use case. Easy to use, powerful, cost efficient. So cost efficiency is another factor that's not really present, it's not really prominent in the personal use case. Offering templates and of course collaboration tools. So collaboration tools again is another value that is not really highlighted in the personal use case. The ICP will be different. So here we're looking at young to middle-aged individuals. Here we're looking at, let's say, employees at SMBs with that headcount. And then finally, the frequency would also be different. So in a use case one, I might have that problem once every 3 to 4 months, while in the case of a company, they might be having this on a monthly basis. Okay, so you can see how these variables can vary from one use case, and it's really important that you lay this out per use case, right? All right, now your turn. I'd like you guys to again on Slido, fill out the use case map for your product against the 5 variables. So first of all, just pick one use case. So if you have multiple one, just pick one use case and define the problem, the alternatives to solving that problem, why your solution is better than anything else, the ICP, and the frequency. Right, great. Okay, who would like to present their use case map? Any brave souls out there?
I can go. No problem.
Okay, Yusuf, go for it.
But
So let me find
yeah,
your
definitely.
so the pharmacy ERP, correct?
Yeah. So we have, as a company, we have multiple use cases, but I picked the pharmacy RP, which is, we have multiple modules that we offer. So for us, a customer can take the whole modules or majority of modules, or they can take individual modules and plug into their system. So I picked someone who would take a lot of our modules as a one take. So that would be a pharmacy RP. The problem, existing solutions are not specialized and therefore require a lot of patching, customizations, or manual work for them to fulfill their needs. The alternatives today, there is other ERP solutions, but they require add-ons on top of them and customization.
Oh, sorry
I
guys.
think,
Sheikh.
yeah, no.
Yeah. Okay. Go on.
Why they would benefit? It helps them streamline operations, support their growth initiatives, and enable their compliance checklist. The ICP, pharmacies with more than 20 branch stores, and the frequency of usage, it is daily use, but every few years they change the software.
Got it. All right, cool. So one thing, thanks for that, Yusuf. So one thing so like we said, again, with the frequency, you can validate that later with data. One thing I would do on the why, and of course, there's not enough time now to brainstorm on that, but just keep in mind with the why, you want to try and be as tangible as possible with the value prop statement. So streamlining operations, supporting growth, enabling compliance, these are all good things, but they're kind of a bit generic and maybe not very tangible. So just keep in mind when you're, for example, because the why, the statement is something that would reflect on different communication touch points, like for example, your homepage, here a section, or maybe in an ad, or maybe in an outbound message or something like that. So try as much as possible to give hard, tangible
Numbers.
reasons for, yeah, got it. For example,
Saving costs
X
by
something by,
20%,
for example, yeah,
compliance 100%, and
got it. Yeah, exactly. Great.
growing by
Thanks,
100%.
you.
Okay.
Thanks, Yusuf.
Yeah.
Prakash, you have a question? Raising your hand? Yeah.
No, I put it up earlier to ask you.
Present? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which one is it?
The one raise observations on construction sites. Second or third one
from the top.
from the bottom.
Oh, from the bottom. Okay. Over here. Yeah. All right, go for it.
Okay, so our use case is for construction workers to raise observations on whilst they're on a construction site. The problem is that it's time consuming to do so, and sometimes it feels like you're telling on your friends, like you're basically back at school and you're kind of tattling on some of your colleagues. The alternatives to doing this are just sending messages via WhatsApps in groups that are set up to manage safety and things like that. Doing it by paper, so taking a note, and sometimes you have boxes where you post these things into, or actually not doing it at all. Actually, so lots of people just ignore it and don't do it. The reason why they do it and they're encouraged to do it is that raising observations is a statistically proven way to reduce incidents and accidents on construction sites. And it's a very simple way of helping to do that. Our ICP are construction supervision or project managers, aged between 25 and 40 usually. Most of them speak quite good English, but often have a second language, particularly in this part of the world. And the frequency that they do it is probably 2 or 3 times a week. Well, the frequency they should be doing it is probably 2 or 3 times a day.
Okay. So the 2-3 times a week, that's the you would say is the current frequency of how they're doing it because of the lack of what your product is offering.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and when then they speed up the frequency, then this would have some impact on their business, correct? That would...
Yeah. So reduction in accidents, so increased productivity, reduction in incidents and accidents that happen, improve morale of the projects.
Got it. All right, sounds good. Thanks, Prakash. And of course, the ICP, because again, now we don't have a lot of time, but with the ICP, of course, the more in depth you go, the better. It's being very extensive with how you detail their profiles. All right, so I'm just gonna comment on one more, and then we'll need to move on. Thanks, Sheikh. You were gonna present another one, right? Your case map.
No,
So
actually, I was not going to present. I was just going to ask a couple
yeah,
questions.
go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, it's related to our business. Like, so we do like, how do you call it? Like underwater robots for inspection. And my question is just around frequency. How do you actually define that in our case? Because like obviously it's marine offshore infrastructure, and some of them need like inspecting only every 10 years, some of them shorter, some of them every month. How is that calculated? Is it like sort of an average that you calculate? How much is it per customer? How much your customer like comes back at you asking for the same product, or is it an average between all customers? How do you
Got you. Yeah, no, great question. So I think if there's a lot of variance in across your user base, you could probably split them into segments. You probably find some similarities between different segments of these customers, whether it's use case or company size or industry or whatever it may be the segments. So you can have frequency per segments. As long as it kind of makes sense, but you don't have to have one average across the board. Yeah, it would be more practical and applicable if you have it per if they're closely tied together.
Okay, clear.
No worries. One thing I wanted to mention here on the use case map here, because this is an example of a low frequency product, so the rent to buy. So with low frequency products, what you can do, because what you don't want to do is you don't want someone to come use your product and then be dormant for months or years. You want to try and come up with some other use case that would bring them back to your product. So I'll give you one example on the case of property apps. So Zillow in the US, they're a big real estate app. You also buy properties through Zillow. So one thing that they do for property buyers or property owners from Zillow is that they've basically created a tool where you can get a valuation of your property on a quarterly basis. So this is basically a side use case to the actual buying of the property, which is the core use case. Just a way to bring the user back to your product, right? So then the user knows that Zillow has this tool, and on a quarterly basis, for example, it sends an email with the potential probable value of the property in that area. So just kind of think of that in the case of low frequency products. Yeah. All right, thanks guys for all your inputs. This is awesome. Level of participation is great. All right, cool. So now looking at the model, so now you have your use case map laid out. The model of any growth model consists of acquisition, retention, and monetization. So the focus is going to be more on these 2 days, going to be more focused on acquisition and retention. And so what you basically have, and this is kind of like the standard, not necessarily exactly the standard, but let's say that the common user journey that the user goes through. And it's split between acquisition and retention. So you have sign up, which is the first the phase. Sign up really is when the user hears about your product and joins. So when I say join, this can be either starting a free trial, it can be booking a demo in the case of, let's say, enterprise only accounts. It can be adding something to a basket or even buying their first product. So sign up is really just the first kind of initiation of a user into your product. And then you have retention. Retention is split into 3 sub-stages. So you have activation. This is when the user understands the value of the product, and not only understands it, but starts to form some routine around using a product. Engagement is the ongoing engagement from that point onward, and finally churn is when the user becomes unengaged or and churns, right? Okay, so later in today's session, I'm going to look at acquisition, and then after tomorrow, we're going to look at retention. All right, so now that you have your use case map, one thing you want to do also is as kind of like a foundational thing is defining your North Star metric. So the North Star metric is a metric or maybe a set of metrics, and typically you wouldn't have more than 1, 2, 3 maximum North Star metrics. But you can think of it as a single metric that best captures the value that your product delivers to customers, right, or users. So just keep in mind here, again, going back to the point of looking at the value in terms of the value that the user experiences, not the value that you as a company generate. Okay. And in most cases, this metric is not necessarily a revenue metric, but rather an action that the user takes. That's one. The second thing is that it's not a percentage metric. So for example, it's not conversion rate. It's not a ratio metric like, let's say, LTV to CAC. So it's not ratio and it's not percentage, it's a volume metric. And it's a volume metric because then it has no ceiling, right? Because when you look at these ratio and percentage metrics, you can plateau very quickly. Like your conversion rate is not going to go infinitely upwards. Same thing with these ratio metrics. But with the volume metric, basically the sky is the limit pretty much, right? So let's look at a couple examples here. Let's look at HubSpot and Facebook and how you would define the North Star metric for each one of these, okay? Let's look at HubSpot. Right, so HubSpot, you can look at monthly active automations as the North Star metric here. So HubSpot, they've sat down, they figured out that the number of monthly active automations that are in the system, this is an indication that users are getting more value. Now, again, this is all hypothetical, but let's assume that they have done the research, they've spoken to customers, they've looked at the data, and they saw that when a user does more of that, having monthly active automations, it means that they are experiencing more value or they're getting more value out of HubSpot. Okay. Let's look at another example, Facebook. So Facebook can have a North Star metric of daily active users. Okay. So the more Facebook brings that number up, the more value is generated across both sides of the marketplace, right? So Facebook has two user segments. It has end users and it has advertisers. So the more daily active users there are on the platform, it's better for both sides. For users, it's better because when more of my friends and connections are on Facebook, I get more value from Facebook as a product. Same thing with advertisers. Obviously, the more active users there are on the platform, the more pool of audience that I'm able to target as a company, right? So this is one example of an NSM that encompasses the value that is generated on both sides. All right, now let's look at another example on how we would formulate the North Star metric. So let's take Talabat as an example. So here the golden audience. So this is end users. Again, they have two sets of audiences, two segments. They have users, end users, and they have their restaurants. Right? So restaurants and end users are the two segments. So let's start with end users or consumers. My goal here is to order food conveniently. The obstacle or the challenge that I'm facing is that I don't have time or energy to cook or go to a restaurant. The solution is that I'm able to order from different local restaurants conveniently. The frequency, let's say it's weekly. So again, this is assuming that they have done the work and they know that the frequency here is weekly. So then the retention metric, or you can call it the North Star metric, is weekly orders delivered. Okay, now notice a couple of things here. One is that you have a frequency component in your NSM, right? It's a volume metric, right? So it's just number of orders. And you see here the component of delivery. And delivery component is important because, again, going back to the definition of NSM, the definition is that it's a metric that best captures the value that the user experiences. Now, if this NSM didn't have the component of delivery in there, and it just said weekly orders, we don't know if the value is actually like this action just in and of itself, the action of ordering does not reflect the value that the user has experienced because the user only experiences the value when the food is actually delivered, right? And this forces then Talabat as a company, it forces them to not only improve the ordering experience, but also to improve the delivery experience. Right? So how fast is the delivery? What types of messaging and communication am I sending the user from the point of ordering to the point of delivery? The person that delivers, how do they act? How do they behave? What do they look like? So all of that is all part of the experience, basically, of the user, the value that the user gets. So that's why something like weekly orders delivered encompasses the true value that the user experiences from using an app like Talmud. Now, if you look at other segments like restaurants, slightly different. So you have restaurants, the goal here is to order outside of the local area, to get orders outside the local area. The challenge here is that expanding the customer base is expensive and involves complex logistics. The solution is to get more customers without branding and big investments, and branding without big investments. And the frequency here is more frequent. In the case of restaurants, they're receiving daily orders. So their frequency is daily in terms of using Talabot. So their NSM would be daily orders delivered. So in this case, Talabat knows that if they grow the daily orders delivered, both of their segments are going to get more value from the product. Yeah. All right. Now, your turn. I'd like you guys to define the North Star metric for your product. Now, keep in mind, 3 components of that. One is the frequency. So it should be a 3-word metric, pretty much, right? So the frequency, the action, and yeah, just the frequency of action, actually. It doesn't have to be 3 words. It can also be 2 words. But just the frequency and the action. All right, great. Who would like to share their NSM, present their NSM? Anyone? I'll just pick.
I'm happy
I'll
to
pick
draw.
randomly, guys. Yeah, go for it.
So it's Alan from Beja, the rent to buy.
Okay. Which one is it? This one, I
Alan
think.
Zero, that one.
No. Yeah, that okay.
So
Yeah,
I guess
all right.
for us, a North Star metric at the end of the day is how many people can get into our apartments. So how many of the people are in the actual end apartment. You would argue that ultimate North Star metric is how many people are actually have bought the apartment in 3 years' time, for example. So that's probably our real North Star metric, but because that's significantly far away, I was just bringing it a bit further into a more realistic one. I guess the issue with it, of course, is the whole frequency piece. So you know, at the end of the day, it's going to be that one-off thing. So that does, underneath that, we have different metrics that we are going to be creating to help retention, whether it's a community feel, community activities, or whatever it may be, to try and get that feedback loop to get the people in the apartments to help share the good word and to spread it to the friends and family.
Yeah, no, it's great. And you know, to your point, in the vast majority of cases, the North Star metric, let's say the ultimate North Star metric, which let's say in this case would be the number of apartments, let's say, bought, you would anyway have input metrics that feed into that final metric, and typically those input metrics would have either a causal relationship or we would correlate with that. Ideally, would be causing the North Star metric. So this absolutely makes sense in terms of a North Star metric to work on now. Number of customers in progress. Great, thanks, thanks, Alan. Who else would like to present? So let me pick this one over here randomly. So 50% monthly active user. Whose NSM is this one? Awesome.
No, it is not me, but I would like to
Okay.
get more about my my NMS North Star metric. So
Okay.
I just typed the NGMV. So since we are aggregator between multiple key stakeholders, so and we just launched the venture recently, so we are keep monitoring the GMV until we rolling out the subscription plan for potential clients. So for the time being, we are just laser focused into the GMV to make sure that we have transaction, that we have kind of client engagements, kind of client product market fit as well. For that reason, this is what we are doing on a daily basis to make sure that we are on the track. Right.
Okay. So yours is this one, correct? Facilitated GMV.
No. It's the glass up. Go next.
Glass Hub. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is a volume metric. This is something that kind of like a number of action or.
Yes, you're right. It's a volume metric that compounded on transaction by transaction based on the request coming through the platform.
Okay. So one thing to add also to that is the frequency component. So whether that number is something that you're trying to grow on a weekly basis or monthly or quarterly or so just keep in mind adding the frequency component to it.
Actually, since we are targeting a big client, we are expecting this is to be in bi-weekly period of time, right? So because it takes time from the big client to get back to us and continue the journey with us.
Sounds good. All right, thanks, awesome.
All
right. So I've seen a few percentage.
Can I participate?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hey, Tarek. So I'm safe number of successful pricing strategies. Now, since we are a dynamic pricing solution for e-commerces, we can say that successful pricing strategies is one way of doing it. And this is mainly defining successful here is that it's either increase the goal of that pricing strategy. So that goal could be a revenue increase or it could be a profit margin increase. I think that's one of it is a bit vague, to be honest. I'm not really sure. But that's one that we can consider. Yeah, what do you think?
And this is something that is trackable in your system. So within your product, you're able to track quote unquote the number of successful pricing strategies. Okay. As long as there's a clear way of defining it and tracking it. And of course, as long as this, so one thing also I wanted to mention, guys, is that because when you're starting out, you will probably have an assumption of an NSM, which is a good starting point anyway. But one thing you want to do later on as you start acquiring more user base or building user base is just validating that this action specifically is one that correlates with long-term retention. And so this is something that will probably come after, let's say, 6 months, 12 months of running of users, of having a sizable user base running or using your product, is basically knowing which actions or set of actions are the ones that when users take them, they end up using your product longer than anyone else, basically, kind of thing. So the metrics that correlate to the long-term retention to basically to validate the initial hypothesis or the initial definition. Great, thanks, Saif.
Can
All
I
right,
add,
thanks.
Tarek, my
Yeah,
experience?
please go ahead.
So what I've learned when it comes to the NSM is that, yes, it is that one number that you put in a huge screen and you give it to everyone in your team and tell them, listen, this is the number that you need to focus on. And it is extremely beneficial because everyone, when they think about sales, technical, customer service, and so on, they put that goal in mind. How do we increase GMV? How do we increase the successful pricing strategies and so on? And a lot of people typically ask, what about other metrics? And typically, there is something called the one metric that matters. And this is a metric that basically feeds onto the NSM. So one metric that matters, basically, it's a specific period of a project. You focus on that metric that will feed later on into the NSM. So let's assume I want to increase the conversion rate of a specific aspect of the journey. That's related to the one metric that matters. But then at the end of the day, that will feed into the NSM. So yes, you'll have multiple metrics, but the main one that all the stuff that you need to focus on will feed into is the NSM.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can think of it as the NSM is kind of like at the top of the tree, and then you have a constellation of input metrics that all feed into that NSM. So typically an NSM would have, let's say, two branches of input metrics, and those two input metrics would have another branch of two or three other branches of input metrics that feed into that. So basically, it's kind of like a tree that all feeds into eventually the final NSM. And the ideal scenario is that each one of these input metrics, it causes the level above it. So if it's a causal relationship, it's the ideal scenario. And if it's not causing it, then at least it would have high correlation with the metric above it in the level above it. But yeah, that definitely makes sense. And then so that basically that all of the functions in different teams would have direct KPIs that basically have a direct impact on their work has direct impact on it.
Yeah, an
Great,
amazing example.
thanks, Saif.
An amazing example, if I may add. Sorry,
One last thing, and then we need to move on. Yeah. Well, yeah, go ahead.
So Facebook, in your example, you're talking about active daily users. So that was the NSM in general. But one team thought about how can we actually increase the active daily users. And what they found out is that as a user, if you don't have 10 friends, I think, or 7 friends within the first 7 days or 10 days, you will not last in this platform.
Right.
And from there, the one metric that matters for them as a project became that we need for him to have 10 friends within 7 days. And this is why you see Facebook nags you every day in the first week to actually add more friends, and so on. So that's how this. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll cover that in the retention session after tomorrow, because then we'll talk about the aha moment. And in that case, actually, that was the aha moment for Facebook, the adding seven friends. All right, great. Thanks, Saif. Thanks, guys, for all your input. This is all great. All right, let's move on now to the concept of compound growth. So as a company, there are, I mean, obviously there are many different ways of growing, but typically you see companies that have linear growth, and you have other companies that have compound growth, and typically the fastest growing companies, as fastest growing brands, are the ones that compound their growth, right? So one of the ways to compound your growth is the idea of loops. Okay, and I'm sure you guys might have come across this, or maybe even have implemented some of that in your business. So you have the funnel approach, which is something that we've all been hearing about for years. Typically, funnels they have linear growth to a large extent, right? So the funnel of acquisition, activation, retention, yada yada yada. The idea of loops, though, is one thing that can compound your growth, and you can think of it as if you guys have bought any stocks or have got into the stock market or investing, buying shares in companies, you understand the idea of compound interest, for example, or also the idea that when you get dividends from stock, you reinvest them into your portfolio. So this idea of reinvesting outputs to form new inputs is the idea of growth loops in the context of growth. So we're going to look at give you guys a couple examples, but we're going to also look at in the acquisition session later today and after tomorrow in the retention or habits the retention session, we're going to dive deeper into these loops and different types of loops and drivers for these. Okay. All right. So growth loops, you can split them into just in terms of categories. Top level, you have acquisition loops and you have habit loops. So acquisition loops, these are loops where the objective of the loop is that when someone comes to your product and signs up, you want that activity or that input to generate another output to bring you new users. So the idea of acquisition loops is basically people that come to your product and use it, they will bring you more users, right? So the idea of referral is very straightforward there and one very easy example. But there are many different types of acquisition loops that we're gonna cover in the second half of the session. All right, so acquisition loops is about bringing new users. Habit loops are about engaging existing users. So habit loops is that when someone comes and uses your product, you want to reinforce positive feelings within that user to get them to come back to the product, right? So one is about bringing new users, the other is about engaging and retaining existing users. I'll give you guys just a couple examples, but again, like I said, we're going to dive deeper into that in the later slides. Let's look at one example for an acquisition loop. Let's take Zoom as a company, right? So any loop typically consists of 3 steps. You have the input, which is the first step. So in this case, a new meeting host signs up for Zoom, right? So for example, I'm a user. I went on Zoom and I signed up, create an account. That's my input. That's the first step. What I'm doing next is that I will schedule a meeting and I will invite attendees to that meeting. That's the second step. The third step, which is the output, is that a percentage of those attendees, when they come and they experience Zoom, they themselves will convert to new hosts and then they would create a new loop, right? So you can see that the output of an acquisition loop is the input of the next loop, right? And basically it keeps spinning like that, right? So the people come, create a meeting, invite others, percentage of those become users, they create meetings, invite others. And this is one of the reasons why Zoom skyrocketed in their growth, especially around COVID time, but simply because they deployed this loop. And this is I'm going to talk about that in more detail later, but Zoom were as a product kind of they were a privileged product to some extent to be able to have that that kind of loop. But we're going to talk about that in more detail. Now, let me give you another example for a habit loop. So let's take Robinhood as an example, okay? So this is an app where you can buy shares or buy stocks. So the input here is that a new user joins Robinhood and creates a watch list. Okay, so a watch list is basically a list of stocks that, for me as a user, I plan to buy these stocks at some point in the future. I just have them in a watch list. I'm just keeping an eye on those stocks. So that's the input, right? The steps here is that Robinhood as an app sends an alert. So I receive an alert as a user when an asset or when a stock, one of these stocks, reaches a certain point. Okay, so Robinhood basically facilitates this idea that for me as a user, I can create a watch list and I can opt in for notifications when the stock price reaches a certain point. So that's the third step, which is the reward. So the third step of a habit loop is a reward as opposed to an output like the acquisition loops. A reward here is that I, as a user, I come back to the product when I receive this notification. I come back to the product and I feel in control, right? I feel in control of the stocks that I'm planning to buy. So this is simply reinforcing a positive feeling in me as a user, right? And again, this applies to all other users, right? So this is just a basic example of a habit loop. Okay. Again, we're going to talk about habit loops in more depth after tomorrow when we talk about retention. All right. So what you want to end up with then, you want to end up with a growth model that looks something similar to that. So over here, you have at the top, you have your linear channels. So that can be things like SEO or paid media or partnerships or influencers or whatever the linear channel may be. And these linear channels are feeding into your acquisition loops and your habit loops. Now, you don't have to have 3 habit loops, acquisition and habit loops. You can start with 1 loop, optimize it, and then see if there's room for other loops. But the idea generally is that these linear channels should be feeding into these loops so that you can accelerate your growth in terms of acquiring the users, and you can accelerate your growth in terms of retaining existing users. And this picture right here, for any company, has to be something that everyone understands fully in the company, regardless whether you're in sales or marketing or product or CS. You have to have the understanding, because this answers the simple question of how does your product grow? Like if you walk on the street, someone stops you and asks you, how does your product grow? This should be the answer to that question. We have these linear channels, they feed into this acquisition loop, and we retain users through that, right? And this should be something that everyone in the company should be able to answer the same way. That's why this view here is important to think about and have it in place.